Good afternoon, y'all. I'm Luz Angeles, security engineer with SHI International Corp. I am based out of Austin, Texas. I've been here for over a decade after I graduated from UT at Austin. Started off in the security space with a little bit of everything. So whether it was identity, data, uh, email, web, really the works here. I was able to go ahead and get into all of it. But really, there are certain facets, such as security operations, that does continue to fascinate me till this day. An extension of that is the security supply chain. But something else about me, besides being passionate about security, is that, oh, okay, it looks like we were able to get it up, if I'm viewing that correctly. Okay, let me exit out mine then. Ah, beautiful. Oh, goodness. Thank you, Diane. I didn't even see all of your comments. Thank you for your empathy here. I see everything now, though, so we are good to go. Let me go ahead and get started here then. So we're on the title slide. Can we move forward to the disclaimer? Thank you for being patient with me on this. Okay. So let me make sure, disclaimer page. Okay. So before we do go ahead and get started, folks, I do have to have a disclaimer here. So these opinions are purely of my own. All data will be cited either throughout the presentation or at the end. If we can move on. Okay, agenda. So the reason I wanted to do this kind of down the supply chain rabbit hole, if you will, is because a lot of these supply chain talks, they're either zoomed in very specific on something like the new NIST publication, or it's something like SBOMs, which is understandable. That is a very difficult subject matter. But I wanted an opportunity to take a step back and look at supply chain as a whole. So we're going to first off break down the supply chain, so those unacquainted can follow along. What better way to understand that than by hearing a story via a case study? So we will get into that, but we will also get into some various available frameworks like MITRE, CIS, and NIST, and we'll cover some best practices. We probably gonna have to run through them, but there's tons of good practices like SIGs, which you might be familiar with, but also ISAC, Centers of Trust, and of course SBOMs. And we will wrap up by quickly reviewing some tools you could also utilize to instill those best practices. And then we'll also review some action items and takeaways. My goal is to make sure y'all understand how important supply chain security is, and that you leave feeling confident on how to move forward with some immediate measures to address potential issues. And we will have time for some Q&A, I think. So, well, if we don't have time, actually, if you don't mind putting the questions while, because I do see the chat now, I'll go ahead and try to answer them throughout. Like, seriously, folks, this is going to be pretty dense subject matter potentially, and I'm not going to dive in into each single area. So if there is a specific question you have, please bring it up. Otherwise, I'm probably going to stay a little bit high level with it. Let's move on to what else about my intro? I'm involved with WESIS and my internal ERG. Just know I am very passionate about women in cybersecurity, and I'd love to be able to go ahead and promote both women and people of color into cybersecurity. I think really that's the only thing you have to know about me. Please feel free to go ahead and connect with me on LinkedIn. I find that space very, very inspiring. So happy to connect with y'all. But we can go ahead and move along just for the sake of time. Okay, so, sorry, we can go ahead and move on to the next slide. So before we begin, we have to understand why securing the supply chain matters. And according to Sonatype, a software supply chain management company, The number of documented supply chain attacks involving malicious third-party components has increased 633% over the past year, now sitting at over 88,000 known instances. And according to a 2021 study by Opinion Matters, who surveyed over 1,000 CISOs, only 13% of companies said that third-party cyber risk was not a priority. So that is good. That's a big drop compared to last year when 31% of companies said that supply chain and third-party cyber risk was not on their radar. Clearly it is now. And 38% of those respondents said that they had no way of knowing when or if an issue arises with a third-party supplier cybersecurity, compared to 31% last year. So we definitely have to aim to be able to go ahead and resolve that. So moving on to maybe some more specific supply chain issues. And keep in mind, we're going to be zooming in a little bit more on software supply chain issues as opposed to hardware, which can honestly be its own presentation. There can be many infiltration points along the supply chain. And one of the main ones I'll call out here is in vulnerabilities in the code. And not just that, but the compounding issues that come with dependencies. This is a great way to establish a foothold and move laterally. And we'll get into that in a second. Stolen certificates, hacker steal certificates used to guarantee the legitimacy or safety of an organization's product. And then they just write on that and they push out malicious code under the pretext that it's the organization's certificate. So it's assumed trust. Poor security standards amongst our vendors and suppliers can be a huge cause for concern, as they can also be assumed to be a trusted party and therefore have more access. Like, for example, emails coming from trusted domains typically won't be blocked, even if that trusted partner had their credentials stolen. And this is even trickier for companies that create or manufacture a solution that could potentially be riddled with vulnerabilities. And tying in from that last point there, so external parties, especially when they're accessing your system resources remotely, could be worrisome if those connections aren't secure. The basic anatomy of a supply chain for the malicious actor, I'll shorten this one up here, is to be able to find some sort of a vulnerability in the code. And certainly the first cases of this that we know of, highly sophisticated work where they were very privy to be able to go ahead and ensure that their code would not be detected. But once maybe like a new software push or just a dependency is pushed out, that's when it starts to trickle out into anybody that is utilizing that code, pushing in updates. And then from there, the objective is to be able to move laterally, see if they can steal some credentials, elevate their privilege, and then get further keys into the castle there and pursue any specific targets that they're wanting to. So we're gonna further break this down by actually going into a case study if we want to move along. And yes, so I could use one of the countless examples of smaller software vendors that were leveraged because they didn't think that they'd be targeted for an attack. I mean, there's so many mom and pop shops that think we don't need to do security. Who's going to attack us? People will attack you. So, I mean, like, think of NotPetya. The original infection vector that was leveraged was through a backdoor by again, family operated accounting software program that was used in nearly every company in Ukraine and others like Maersk, which allowed exploits like Eternal Blue to infiltrate and spread malware, crippling the operations of large companies. It still stands as one of the costliest cyber attacks in history. Or I could point out how Log4Shell and the adoption rate for fixed versions only sits at around 65%. Although, that was from August 2022, so hopefully that's grown. I mean, heck, there's also the industrial control attack that we can go ahead and kind of dig into. Again, keeping in mind, there's just so many factors here, but let's go ahead and move on and dig into the specific use case I want to talk about today. And sorry to beat the same old drum, but with SolarWinds coming back up in the news again, due to SEC guidelines. I figured we'd dig into them a little bit more, especially as they appear to be one of the largest in terms of most widespread supply chain attacks we've ever seen so far. So for those unaware, SolarWinds was founded over 20 years ago. It's an IT platform that offers modules around ITAM, observability, service management, performance management, and security. So picture this. It's December 2020. Imagine you are the CEO of SolarWinds when Kevin Mandia from, yes, Mandiant FireEye calls you up, tells you that your flagship module, Orion, that is currently being used by over 33,000 customers, including Boeing and 9 other federal agencies, is infected with an insidious backdoor, and that he is going to announce this to the public in 24 hours. No exceptions. So around September 2019, so rewind a little bit, hackers who were later attributed to Russia were able to infiltrate Orion and insert their malicious code, which has been dubbed Sunspot, which in turn created a backdoor. It was not caught by SolarWinds when they started to verify their update. So they did digitally sign it and were now unknowingly spreading this malicious DLL on the next round of updates to all of their customers. Now, for the customers that did install the update, the DLL waited for 2 weeks to clear suspicion before communicating back to command and control, which also imitated Orion protocols and domains. So it was very under the radar. The backdoor allowed for Teardrop, another malware package, to go towards targeted networks that were also able to further proliferate. The goal seemed to be gaining access to targeted email accounts. And they actually did this by stealing the ADFS private keys, which at that point equates to the keys to the kingdom, honestly. So now they could forge SAML assertions, which bypasses the need for both credentials and even MFA, which allowed them to easily impersonate users. So they got really, really deep. Now, the only reason SolarWinds became aware of this compromise was because FireEye was also investigating how they had a backdoor installed into their own environment. Yeah, really horrendous to be able to think about. And by the way, big thank you to Wired and Zero Networks on this case study, as they really broke down the ins and outs of how this would all look like here. So moving along, let's go ahead and talk about some lessons learned from this. So due to the scale and sheer amount of coverage that was given to the SolarWinds supply chain attack, we were able to luckily learn a lot of lessons from the victim's perspective. The most obvious here is that anyone, even cybersecurity companies, can fall prey to supply chain attacks. And if you are considered a high value target, being proactive on testing all avenues of potential vulnerabilities is necessary. In this case, because SolarWinds update was assumed to be trusted due to that digital signature, it was difficult to detect via typical detection methodologies. However, we can also address this by insisting on extra layers of trust and verification, such as an SBOM or even a questionnaire that includes requirements around the SBOM. And we'll talk about some others here in a second. But defense in depth, for example, AV and EDR tools were actually shut down in this specific case because of that worm. But implementing, especially practices around zero practice, like reinforcing least privileged access, is going to make a lot of ways to reinforce that model, and most importantly, prevent lateral movement and remote access. Could have really limited a lot of the damage there. There are some really good practices here that we can specifically look at, such as enabling only legitimate server-to-server traffic, only for necessary ports, blocking all client-to-client network access. And even though MFA was compromised, ensuring that you are layering that is utterly important. And lastly, if your customers are considered to be high value or sensitive targets, like a federal agency, for example, we should be very careful on deciding whether or not to include them on our public website or make the potential repercussions clear if you're going to be asking permission, which hopefully you should be. All right, so let's go ahead and move on into some of the items that I want to go through. So if you haven't heard, the the Biden administration's executive order on improving America's cybersecurity requires vendors to apply secure development and supply chain practices. Yes, the executive orders are only obligatory to federal departments and agencies, but they do serve as a good guidance for the private sector as well. So yeah, a little bit messy, even though there is a mandate. In the absence of that legal mandate, it will be challenging to get private organizations to get there, but there are fantastic guidances that are being created. And if you take a look at SolarWinds as an example, they're back in the news because of SEC guidelines. So this has a way of coming around here. And we are going to get into frameworks first and foremost, and I want these to become your best friend. So let's go ahead and jump in. Again, these are going to be high level, so let me know if there are any questions here in particular. So MITRE's system of trust. This is a realistic assessment of your supply chain security maturity. One of the immediate action items here should be to establish a baseline using recommended guidelines and frameworks. I first saw this, MITRE saw it in the 2022 RSA conference, and the sheer amount of resources they had already built was wonderfully overwhelming. Now, MITRE SOD is aiming to become the standard for supply chain. They've already done many pilots. They're a standard whenever it comes to chip manufacturers, operational technologies. They've also expanded to finance, energy, defense, telecom, etc. This will cover all areas of the supply chain. You can see on the screen here that it starts with, suppliers, supply services, and then 12 top level decision risk areas that goes down. They also have a risk model manager that is interactive that can go ahead and cater to your specific organization. All right, moving on. So the NIST Cybersecurity Supply Chain Risk Management Program is incredible. They are aiming to help organizations to manage the increasing risk of supply chain compromise related to cybersecurity. Now, for this one in particular, what's wonderful about this is that it does not only cover cybersecurity, it covers all functions of your entire business, as supply chain should. So when you're going through this document, which is huge, by the way, all of the appendices are extremely useful, whether you need help on including some kind of a verbiage, say for SIG questionnaires, they have an appendix for that. If you need to be able to go ahead and substantiate support for this to your executives, there's an appendix for that. Very, very useful documentation. It's right there on NIST. So make sure that you are able to go ahead and download it. And listen, you don't need everything. You just need to go ahead and figure out which areas are going to be relevant to, which they do list, by the way. So let's go ahead and hit on the very last one here, which is a CIS, Center for Internet Security, and Aqua created a comprehensive benchmark and a guide for supply chain security, which is curated for DevSecOps teams and anyone who is involved with planning, developing, deploying, assessing, or securing solutions to build and deploy software. It's community built and it's meant to be practical. And yes, you can download it on GitHub today. So these are very practical recommendations that you can go ahead and start to go through and will help you be able to reinforce good source code practices. So those were just 3 and they can be highly catered there. So let's go ahead and move on to some other best practices that you can go ahead and start to follow through on. So yeah, the SBOM slide. So if you've heard anything about supply chain security, then you most certainly have already heard about the SBOMs. I want to explain here, but basically it boils down to I'll lay out a statistic there. So Sonatype analyzed over 12,000 libraries commonly used in enterprise applications and found that only 10% of them had vulnerabilities directly in their code. That's not bad. However, when you're including transitive vulnerabilities from dependencies and dependencies of those dependencies, the incident rose to a whopping 62%. It's like on average, each library had like 5.7 dependencies. So because of how insidious those dependency trees can go down, being able to go ahead and ensure that you're instilling best practices around your SDLC software development lifecycle, that's why it's utterly important here. Trust me, folks, there are entire talks around just SBOMs alone, so I highly encourage you to be able to go ahead and seek those out. We're going to go ahead and move on to the notion of transparent trust in general. So traceability concepts should be emphasized and documented, allowing organizations to share transparency, identify disruptions, and respond faster to issues. Centers of trust, also known as trust centers, publicly showcase how companies ensure their solutions are secure. So originally only organizations like Microsoft, Cisco, Google, IBM published these, but in the spirit of being proactive with security and compliance, we're seeing many, many more companies extend their compliance over to the Compliance Center to include this. The Trust Center describes the technologies, procedures, policies, and controls for protecting their infrastructure and their customers' data from cyber attacks. And then by giving customers transparent access, the public can better understand how companies manage their data and how they can keep confidential information secure and protected. And they do also lay out procedures for notifying security experts if vulnerabilities are discovered. So you absolutely want to be able to go ahead and see how they escalate that. Other aspects may include SIG questionnaires. So standardized information gathering questionnaires are used to assess vendors and manage third-party risks. They come in two versions, Core and Light. The difference being that Core has over 900 questionnaires, I think nearly 900. And the Light has a little bit over 126. The other difference is that Core will meet all of the legal requirements. Light is a good starting point. So if you're overwhelmed, start with Light. SIGs are used for companies who outsource to assess a vendor's security. They may be included in RFPs. They should absolutely do that. And NIST does also have an appendix for that. And they can also be used for self-assessments and obviously third parties. But they're not always used to their full potential. So make sure you're tailoring the questionnaires for your specific use case on the vendors, and make sure you're asking the right questions, and don't just ask if they have a plan. Inquire about the last time they tested it, for instance. Also, if a vendor does have a high critical rating, consider if executive level approving should be required. These can be automated, but I'm jumping ahead of myself here. Let's hit on the last best practice. Last but not least, you should absolutely aim to join and contribute to ISACs, which are information sharing and analysis centers. So you are aware of any vulnerabilities along your supply chain and are able to go ahead and get ahead of it. Let's go ahead and move on to, I think, one of the last sections here. I'm just recapping some actual practical tools that you can go ahead and take away if we want to dig into the tools here. So I do not underestimate the value of tools. When you buy them, you are expected to produce good ROI results. Hopefully they're not just shelfware. So it is good motivation to put them to use. So tools like Sonatype that I mentioned earlier and Sneak are, and amongst many more, are catered specifically to the supply chain and managing that risk vector. Sneak in particular, they can help you control open source risk across your SDLC. And speaking of those questionnaires, so companies like a Security Scorecard, BitSight, Navix looks at the security practices of open source projects. For example, if you have any open source projects, you may have unfixed vulnerabilities, if they're updating their dependencies, if they're running command line tests, code fuzzing, and amongst many more, and plus application security tooling. Cyware is a tool that, just on the other screen, leverages ISACs to bidirectionally share threat intelligence around vulnerabilities. So they're essentially automating that process for you so that you don't have to do it manually. Zero Networks, the company that made that sunburst diagram, has an access orchestrator for enforcing least privilege. So getting a little bit into the zero trust space, if you will. And what's cool about that one is that once configured, the access orchestrator will revoke all network permissions except for the ones that are required for legitimate business activity. Then permissions are given to protected assets only if the users are able to prove their identity via MFA. Tabletop exercises. So whether you're doing these internally or externally, you should be rehearsing drills around breaches and attacks, specifically to supply chain causes. And especially as these will continue to involve multiple branches of your team. So for example, an RSA breakout that I did involved somebody being an IT team. We had incident response, we had legal, we had marketing, we had center of trust, and we all had to come to terms with how to be able to respond to a supply chain attack. So just something to go ahead and keep in mind there. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up because I realize we're well over time. So I appreciate your patience, and for those that did actually hang out with me here. So action items. I mean, assess your supply chain maturity, whether it is NIST, MITRE system of trust, or if you're in the SDLC, maybe using CIS, that benchmark. Find out somewhere where you can go ahead and kind of assess where you are at. So you know where to start, you know where you might need to possibly ask help for. Align to the ideal framework. So do not feel like you need to do all three. Pick a one that suits your use case specifically. I started maybe with the most comprehensive to the more practical NIST to the very specific CIS. So make sure you're picking the one that best suits your use case. And besides that, there are other emerging frameworks as well, like ISO 27K that has its own verbiage. Evaluate what processes, policies, tools, teams, etc., need to be implemented. That's something that hopefully you can go ahead and start to gather from all of the little snippets you just got from here. All right, and then takeaway. So let's go ahead and end with saying that, yeah, it can be overwhelming to realize that supply chain security is here to stay, especially with how sophisticated these attacks can be, and especially knowing how large of a problem it's going to be potentially to have to figure out how to fix your source code. However, we have a plethora of resources and best practices established within our communities that are very eager to help. It's a very helpful community. That's really it. Have hope, be optimistic. I just really scratch the surface in terms of the incredible resources there. These are the resources, by the way, there's plenty out there. And I just want to give a huge thank you to all those folks that again stuck around with me. Okay, Diane, I do see we have some questions here. Yes, thank you for laying out the SBOMs. I'm trying to bring someone to the AWS Community Day event to do tabletop exercises. Do you do them specifically? Absolutely. Loop in AWS there. Honestly, I'm assuming you're using AWS for some of your private cloud workloads. If that is the case, you certainly want to go ahead and bring them in, see what their specific flavor is going to be so you are familiar with what their escalation path will be. How do we go ahead and report those effectively? Do I need to be looking at a specific threat intelligence monitor? Maybe it's a center of trust that you can monitor for AWS. That's a really good question, especially since AWS is probably going to be a keeper of a lot of your valuable items. If there aren't any other questions, then I will go ahead and wrap it up here. Again, apologies for the delay at the beginning, but we got there. Huge thank you to the folks who were able to get me up and running here. And thank you so much for your time. Hope you'll have a good rest of the day on the additional sessions here.